And I think we're good. Hello, everyone. My name is Ross Kimbarovsky. Happy to be here with you today. We are talking about the importance of strong visual branding. And just to set expectations, I'm going to talk for about 15 minutes about branding for nonprofits and walk you through some of the core elements, the important things you need to think about. And then we're going to spend the rest of the time looking at your branding. So many of you were brave enough to offer your websites, your logos for a group conversation. And when we get to that part, which will be pretty soon, I'm going to ask all of you to participate. So not just the people that submitted it, but this is a free-flowing conversation, because my goal by the end of the session is to help you understand these concepts well enough to take your own visual branding, be able to critique it, and ultimately apply the lessons you learn in improving it. So let's get started. One note on the title slide, and you'll also find that KeeLabs will provide this as well. We have a very thorough nonprofit branding guide on the Crowdspring blog. And so you'll have a link right on the title slide and the link on the last slide. And you should have, I think, this available at the end. Take a look at it, because it goes in a lot more depth than we're going to be able to cover today. So there is, on the second slide, I'm not going to go into it, information about Crowdspring. We're a global design platform. The one thing I want to emphasize on this slide is that from the time that we launched, we started with a program we call GiveBack, which is our way of helping worthy nonprofits and charities around the world. So about once a month, we pick a candidate for our GiveBack program, and they get free design, whether it's a logo design or a website design or a design of a brochure. Our designers work for free. We waive all of our fees. We work closely with a nonprofit. If you're interested in that program, you can go to crowdspring.com/give-back, and the link will be in the PDF presentation that you'll see to learn more about it. So the thing about design is that most people make the mistake of underinvesting in design. And Dr. Ralph Speth, who's the CEO of Jaguar Land Rover, I think said it best. Good design can be expensive, but if you think that good design is expensive, you should look at the cost of bad design, because the challenge with bad design is it doesn't accomplish what you need to accomplish in building a strong brand. And more importantly, it creates the absolute wrong reaction in your communities. And visual design impacts people the same way, whether you're a nonprofit brand or a for-profit company, because at the end of the day, what you're trying to do is build a brand. And the best way to think about what brands are is to look at a McGraw-Hill magazine ad from a number of decades ago. This ad was targeting for-profit companies. And the point of the ad was to show that most people don't know anything about your company, don't know anything about your products, don't know anything about your reputation. And yet you're constantly trying to sell. And in thinking about this ad, it occurred to me that nonprofits face the exact same challenges. And if we turn it into a nonprofit perspective, a person who visits your website, a person who talks to one of your staff or volunteers, doesn't know who you are, doesn't know your nonprofit, probably doesn't know your mission, doesn't really know the community you serve or your reputation. And yet, most nonprofits, like most companies, almost instantly ask for a donation or for somebody to volunteer without telling much of a story or talking about the brand. And this is where I think nonprofits and companies fall short. So the first important lesson, and this is one of the most important things I want you to take away from this conversation, is that your nonprofit brand is much more than your name and your logo. When you ask business owners or nonprofit founders, how do you feel about your brand? Many of them will say, I feel like I have a good logo, or I feel like I can improve my logo. And the problem is that it's not accurate to think about your brand as just your logo, because ultimately your brand identity is everything that you, your staff, your volunteers, and the general public can see, obviously much more than your logo. Your brand image is how people perceive your brand. So when you think about visual identity, it's your logo, it's your name, it's your website, it's your social media accounts, the signs that you put on at events, the t-shirts that people wear. If you have business cards, the business cards you hand out. If you are promoting certain events, it's the promotions, the messaging that you use around those events. If you talk to people, it's the conversations you have and the voice that you use. So it's your entire identity. But the most important thing is how people perceive your brand. Because ultimately, every organization, whether it's a for-profit or a nonprofit organization, has a brand identity. And you can definitively try to say, here is what I think my brand is. And at the end of the day, what's most important is how do people perceive it? And this is the difference between successful nonprofits and those that struggle. One way to tell that story, and thinking back to that ad I shared a couple of minutes ago, is to explain to people what it is that you do, how you do it, and why they should care. And it's all about storytelling. And storytelling is really important in marketing, in advertising, whether you're promoting a nonprofit brand, a for-profit brand, it really doesn't matter, because people like to hear stories and they make connections through this storytelling. And as we look at some of the examples, you'll see that some do a really nice job telling a story in a short amount of time and space, and others struggle to do that. The other thing that stories do, and this is extremely important, is they help to educate your volunteers and your staff, as well as your donors, about your nonprofit. Because remember, you're building an identity for your organization, and what you say matters. What you write matters. If you have 10 people working on your organization and all 10 are telling a different story, all 10 are telling a slightly different version of your mission or your values, then you're going to create a bit of confusion. And so if you tell the story in a way that helps educate, then they are more likely to tell a story in a way that helps to communicate that information. The best nonprofits find a way to create symbolism around their missions. And so I want to show you some examples to challenge you to think about ways you can create symbols to promote your nonprofit identity. Now, this is also true in the for-profit space. And at the end of the day, a logo is just a symbol. So an effective logo has two components, and you could see this in the American Red Cross example. There is a logo type, and those are the words. So we're just talking about American Red Cross. And then there's an icon, a mark, that's an image that is meant to represent that organization. And a good logo, a strong logo, can be used like this together, or you can just use parts of it separately. So if you see a cross on a white background and the cross is red, most people, because this is one of the most renowned nonprofits in the world, are generally going to believe this is the Red Cross, or in the US, the American Red Cross, because that symbol has come to be associated with that organization. So whenever you think about ways you can promote your organization more beyond just your name and logo, find ways to do that through symbols. And I'll show you a couple of more examples. Here's Goodwill. Goodwill has a fun, engaging way in approaching this question. I suspect many of you probably don't know that the symbol that appears near the top, which looks to be part of a smiley face, is actually identical to the G in Goodwill. So the designer that created this wanted to connect the two. So it is both a smiley face, so it tends to put a smile, or tends to make us at least happier than we otherwise would be when we see it. But it is the G in Goodwill, and makes that interesting connection. Again, pretty simple. Salvation Army, very simple symbol with their name that's easily recognizable everywhere. Feeding America, very simple symbol with the name. And the reason I show this is because in many of the examples that I see, particularly in the nonprofit space, nonprofits try really hard to create complex symbols. And the challenge with complex symbols is that it's hard for people to interpret those symbols. And it's really difficult for people to relate to others. And so simplicity is really important here. Every single decision that you make, each and every action that you take affects your brand. And so it goes back to what I said earlier. It's everything visual plus everything auditory, the things you say, the conversations that you have. And so it's really important for you to be deliberate about this. Let's make sure Lori had a question. She has a split screen. So somebody can answer that. Hopefully, everybody else able to see this okay? If we can get just a couple people to let me know. If we're good, then I'll continue unless somebody chimes in. Okay. So one way that nonprofits can learn and do a better job with their overall identity is by doing something called a SWOT analysis. Now, this is a process that's commonly done in the for-profit space, but it works really well for nonprofits too, because it asks you to evaluate four things: your strengths, your weaknesses, your opportunities, and your threats, to try to figure out where is your brand, where is your nonprofit falling short in delivering value to your audience, in delivering a message to your donors, in delivering a message to your volunteers. And in the guide that I started talking about when I started the presentation on the Crowdspring blog, crowdspring.com/blog/nonprofit-branding, you'll see a good description of what a SWOT analysis is and all of the questions that you should be asking yourself when you do a SWOT analysis. Now, let's talk about brand elements. And I want to give you some foundational rules that we're going to use in a few minutes to talk about some of your own nonprofit brands. So the first thing that you want to make sure you create when you create a visual identity is it needs to be memorable. And there's a simple reason for that. If people can't remember your nonprofit, if they can't recognize your nonprofit when they see a website or they see a sign, then they're going to have a hard time telling somebody else about it. You're going to have a very tough time getting volunteers. You'll have a very hard time prompting donors to donate. And so one example, bad example, in the profit space and the nonprofit space is when somebody in the medical space, as an example, takes a very common generic icon that's associated with medical and uses it in their name. And you could see in this example, you've got very similar looking icons. You could slap any name on them. It stays generic. It's indistinguishable. It's not memorable. If these represented 9 different nonprofits or 9 different companies, no person could tell the difference between them. And unfortunately, this commonly occurs across the world when people brand. Second thing, it has to be meaningful. So people need to be able to derive some meaning from your visual identity. And it starts with your name, it continues to your logo, and it continues to everything else you create that's a visual identity. So we're going to look at some examples of logos. And the question that we'll be asking is it meaningful? Can we take a look at this logo and derive any meaning that connects to the nonprofit? Sometimes the answer is yes. And sometimes the answer is no, because it's really confusing to understand what somebody's trying to do. Third, it has to be likable. And this is important because particularly for a nonprofit, you are speaking to a very specific audience. And that audience is hopefully your donors, your volunteers who share your passion about your mission. And so the way you communicate with them, which includes the fonts that you use, the colors that you use in your logo and your website, your marketing materials, the voice that you use to communicate those things is relevant. If your nonprofit is trying to solve a problem for men, for example, you're not likely to be using the color pink as a main color for your nonprofit. On the other hand, if you're dealing with issues related to cancer, that's very common because those are associations that already exist. So it has to be likable. It has to be transferable, meaning you should be able to take your branding and your visual identity and put it on a small, tiny business card or a pen, put it on a hat, put it on a t-shirt, on a huge billboard in the middle of an interstate, because ultimately it needs to give you the flexibility to do many different things with it. And it has to be adaptable. And adaptability is an important concept because you don't want to be changing your brand every couple of years. The most successful companies in the world create a visual identity and it stays with them for long periods of time. Now, they may tweak it. They may make some slight changes to it, but at the end of the day, it's very recognizable. Coca-Cola is a great example. In the nonprofit space, Salvation Army, Goodwill, lots of nonprofits create a strong identity, they build it, and it's consistent over time, so people are never confused. It also needs to be protectable. It has to be, whether or not you claim trademark protection for your logo, or you defensively say this isn't a unique identity. It needs to be unique, because otherwise you're going to have hundreds of organizations that look the same, that have the same sounding name, that have a similar logo, that have the same website templates. And so find something that sets you apart. And let me just show you some examples from the for-profit space, just to start our conversation. And the reason I take these examples from the for-profit space is because I think a lot of nonprofits make a very common mistake. They think that a great way to build a nonprofit is to look at other nonprofits. And so they'll look at the Salvation Army, Goodwill, the American Red Cross, and these other organizations and say, well, what does their branding look like? And those are all really good examples, but I want to encourage you to be broader than that. Look at examples from the for-profit space, because a brand is a brand. And the visual elements that relate to a brand are all useful examples, whether it's a nonprofit or a for-profit. So first example, and I'd love some feedback from you. So you can unmute yourself, and there are two ways you can do it. You could press the space bar on your keyboard while you talk. It works just like walkie-talkie. So whenever you're talking, you'll unmute yourself, and then when you release the space bar, you'll mute yourself again, or you can unmute yourself physically. So here's an example. We've got two logos. Which of these is unique and interesting, and which is bland and generic?
I think Bog Street looks pretty interesting.
Why?
Well, you've got an interesting shape of a frog that also has what looks like it may be a guitar inside of it, which is a pretty specific image, as opposed to just a hanger, which is a fairly generic image for really any retail store that sells clothing.
So good observation. Ultimately, if you're trying to create a unique identity, you want to have something that's a little different. So the G smiley face in Goodwill, the negative space guitar, and it's called negative space because it's all white and it's within the color black, but ultimately you could see a guitar. It's much more memorable. You're going to remember that frog and guitar tomorrow. You're not going to remember the hanger. Okay, how about another example? Which of these is more versatile, meaning you can use it in a lot of variety of different ways, small, big? And you could feel free to just type in chat or unmute yourself and talk. So we've got a couple comments, and I'll read through them. Most people are saying Beehive is more versatile because it's simpler. Rachel says Beehive because you could just use the icon, and that's a great observation. So we talked about this earlier. Remember, the logo type, the actual words of your name, in this case Beehive Beauty, can be used separately from the actual beehive itself, which is a nice unique mark that can be used differently. With the other example, it's just a generic symbol of some sort. You can't take them apart. So the name is integral to the slice of bread and everything else. And if you just show the slice of bread as a separate image, it's not artistically unique. It's not visually unique. Other really good comments. Scott Walker says more white space in Beehive, which is accurate. White space promotes readability. So whenever you want to help people read and more easily understand what you wrote, you want to have enough white space in your visual elements so that you're not constantly interfering with what you're looking at. Okay, let's look at one other example. Which of these is more unique? You have Space Monkey Partners on the left and Grounded Coffee Shop on the right. So I want to know why too. So I know most of you are saying Space Monkey, but tell me why. So Scott says use of color in Space Monkey works for me, and that's one good observation. You have black as the dominant color in both, but Space Monkey does something a little different. It adds a yellow, which emphasizes that word a lot more, and for readability and memorability, that's a nice example. Jessica says Grounded uses too generic of a symbol. And that's a really good observation. I mean, think about it. You are going to never remember a coffee shop that uses a bag of coffee or a coffee cup as its main symbol, just like you wouldn't remember a Catholic charity that uses a cross that looks the same as the main symbol. You're going to remember Space Monkey Partners because the icon there is an image of a monkey in a spacesuit helmet. And so it's a creative way to communicate that information. So lots of really good ideas. I'm trying to pick out, there's a lot of them from you guys. I'm trying to pick out a few of them, but lots of good thoughts. Which logo uses color better in this example? You have Serene Clinic on the left, and you have Guy Next Door Window Cleaning on the right. So, and again, I want to hear why. So it's important to hear from you which one, but really why is important, because we're trying to layer the lessons that we need to go through as we start looking at websites and branding. So Guy Next Door is bolder and good contrast from Catherine. Good observations. Ultimately, contrast is really important. This shows you that the color combinations that you use are going to impact the readability for people. So yellow on white, not the best combination. Blue on white, particularly dark blue on white, more readable. And you can actually see it in the blue. So if you look carefully at the darker blue, Guy Next Door, and then Window Cleaning, which is lighter blue, you can readily see that the darker blue is just more readable. So the lesson here is the more contrast you provide on your websites, your marketing materials, in your logo, the more readable it'll become. UN says Guy Next Door is better. A window is more likely in blue color. And that's a good observation. So again, this goes to likability and memorability. So when we look outside our window, we want to see a blue sky. That tells us everything is great. The sun is out. So the Guy Next Door is showing what we might typically expect, and that's associated with a good mood for us. Serene Clinic doesn't leave us with that kind of an impression. In fact, at least for me, it feels kind of weird. It's yellow. It's a little bit depressing in that sense. Okay, let's look at one example. I think this is the last one. Which logo is clean, simple, and easy to understand? So you have Stamped Patio Solutions on the left, Sugar High Records on the right. And then why? The important thing is why. I want you to start thinking about why, not just which one do you like. So Jameson says, Sugar High is better with a clear emphasis on the product. And that's a good observation. Scott says Sugar High because Stamped is too busy. And that's a really good observation. First of all, look at the Stamped logo. The only thing we can legitimately make out is Stamped Patio Solutions. It's really tough to read everything else. And imagine that as the social media icon. You can't read most of it. You probably could read Stamped, but that's about it, which means that you've lost a huge part of your brand identity in trying to communicate who you are. Jessica says Sugar High is simple, using only one color and simple type. Good observation. It's easier to read. So Yan says, Nathalie says, disadvantage Sugar High is I thought they were selling donuts, which is an interesting observation. Now, the cool thing is that's what they were going for. When you look at the icon, it's a record that looks like a donut. And of course, the reason it looks like a donut is Sugar High Records, because we normally will get a sugar high if we eat lots of donuts. So part of the reason that could be effective is it causes us to think about what they're trying to do. And the process of thinking about what they're trying to do is itself sufficient to record a more memorable impression in our brains. So great comments. So Roman asks, you don't recommend having the main product of a company as a logo? In other words, coffee in a coffee shop company or donut as a donut company? So generally, the answer to that is no. As a general rule, it's too generic. First of all, it limits you. Imagine if you're a donut shop like Dunkin' Donuts, selling only donuts, and all of a sudden you decide to sell other things. And this is not an imaginary example. This actually happened in the last year. They had to completely rebrand their entire company to Dunkin' when they started adding menu items and remove the word donuts. So using that very specific generic example limits you and forces a rebrand later on whenever you expand. And it's also not very creative, as you saw in those examples of the coffee cups. I'll deal with a gradient question in a moment. So One thing before we move on to the examples that I would encourage all of you to do is to create a brand style guide. We cover this in the nonprofit branding guide, but a style guide is essentially a document that talks about the specific ways your logo should be shown, the fonts that you want to use on your website and marketing materials, the sizes for everything, the colors that you use. So when you work with a designer, they'll give you this information. So there are two types of colors. There's the RGB color for web, and there's CMYK colors for print, and they are different. So we could say the color blue, but to a printer who's trying to print and replicate the exact color you use in your logo, they need the CMYK values for the color. And a web designer who's trying to create your website is going to need the RGB color. So all of that goes into a brand style guide, and we cover that in the nonprofit branding. And then finally, I want to deal with one question about rebranding, because some of you are going to find yourself asking, well, should I take the time now and change my logo, change my name, rework my website? And the answer is, if you are finding that you have a pretty nice visual site, you're telling a good story, then you may be fine. There's no need to rebrand. But if you're struggling to find volunteers, if you're struggling to find donors, if you feel like your visual identity is disconnected, where your logo isn't connected to your website and your social profiles are totally different, this may be the time to step back and say, let's start rebuilding this brand again. And for a nonprofit, that's not a let's do it all at once, because it's a time-consuming process. Start with your name, go to your logo, look at your website, and do it sequentially over a period of 6 to 12 months. And one of the reasons we started Crowdspring is it doesn't have to be expensive. We cut prices 10 to 50 times over what normally nonprofits and businesses pay for these kinds of services. Okay, there was a question about gradient colors and logos from Jameson. And the short answer before we go to the examples, let me just show you so you have it. This is my contact information, and again, the nonprofit branding guide, so that you can grab it and read in much more detail. I'm going to stop this share, and I'm going to share the screen where we're going to review your examples now. So, and then I'll answer before we start on that conversation, the gradient question in a moment. So let me share the examples. So Jameson asked about gradients, and the answer to the gradients question is that gradients complicate logos, and ultimately you have to look at trends and fads in design. So the more complexity in your logo, the more difficult it will be to reproduce it, the more costly it will be to reproduce it, and the more likely it's going to fall out of flavor, fall out of style. And so while there are some people and some brands that use gradients effectively, generally don't overcomplicate your visual identity, because overcomplicating it really doesn't create a tremendous amount of advantage for you, but creates lots of disadvantages. Okay, so let's start with a couple of examples. We're going to start with logos, and just to remind you, your brand is not your logo, or put differently, your logo is not your brand. And I would encourage you all to unmute and speak rather than type, but you can do either, whatever your preference is. We're going to walk through about 10 to 20 examples. Again, the goal here is to be constructive. These are examples from people in the audience in the webinar. They've graciously volunteered to have us talk about their brands, their website designs, the visual elements they've created. And so we want to try to help them improve, and also give each of you an opportunity to learn how to evaluate your brand. So the first one is a logo for an organization called Changing Your Conversation. So I guess the first question, and probably the most useful one, when you don't know what a brand is about, what do we think this organization does? And can you tell from the logo? So just a reminder, if you want to unmute yourself, hold your space bar on your keyboard while you're talking, and then let go to mute yourself back up again.
Can we actually see if people can unmute themselves? I'm not sure if people are able to. I know that they're able to raise their hand. And if that is the case, we are able to allow them to talk. Yeah, I don't think the webinar, unfortunately, is able to. Jameson is saying not able to. So if you want to talk, please raise your hand, and then we'll allow you to talk. Yep. Sorry about that, everyone.
Okay, and you could type. So again, it's perfectly fine if you want to just leave comments. I'll look through these as I've been doing periodically, but really the question for all of you is what does this organization do? So there's a good example. You see a logo for the first time. Do you know what they do? So Jameson says not able to tell what this organization does. So Rachel says, I assume this organization helps people have different kinds of conversation. Bunch of other people said, no idea, not clear what the purpose is. Nathalie says something girly. And so the girly presumably is related to the colors that are used here because it uses the color pink. And so this is a good example of a situation where you have a logo that doesn't really communicate strongly what your brand is about. So if you only have an opportunity to show your logo to people, are they going to walk away knowing anything about your organization? Because if they can't, it's going to be hard for them to communicate about your organization.
Hi, Rose. At first, I thought it was like a maybe makeup kind of because of the colors, but then reading the change in your conversation, I believe it's something about empowerment. But yeah, it's still it's hard to figure it out what it is.
Okay, so I would ask all of you to subject your own logos to the same kind of review. Does your logo tell any story about your organization? And there's a second level in how I want to push you to look at these logos. If you eliminate the word changing your conversation, does the rest of it have any meaningful connection to or tell any kind of story? Because changing a conversation is the only thing that lets us have any sense of what this organization might be about. The rest of it, and this is true for visual design generally, and you'll see this in the examples we're going to be talking about shortly. Anything that you add to words, so it's images, it's photographs, it's videos, it's icons, should complement and tell a better story together with the words, and not detract and create noise and confusion. So in this case, for example, it's possible that Katie says that reversal of the C speaks to change because you have opposite C's, but it's unspecific what the change relates to. And ultimately, that's a challenge. Now, this organization provides free life and career coaching to at-risk women. And ultimately, I think a lot of you talked about that this is directed to women. This is about having changes in conversations. And so those are good observations. But I would push you, as you look at your logos, to ask whether the other elements of the logo are helping or hurting you tell that story. Okay, let's look at the next example. $1 Hero Foundation. What do we think this organization does? So a bunch of people are talking about, so Melinda and Jameson are talking about military support. Can I zoom in on the logo? Yes, I should be able to zoom in on the logo. Does that help? Donations to veterans. Yeah, some more examples. Aviation. So part of the challenge, again, you've got two elements here. You have a visual icon, and you have the words. And so those two have to work together. Larry says it's clever and unique, which may reflect a club logo where members already identify with the organization. I guess he was talking about with regard to changing the conversation, the prior logo. So Lama says, I see military money and children because of the foundation font. So these are all good observations. Now, let me just remind myself, because so this organization, actually, we didn't get an explanation of what they do. Whoever runs this or founded this, can you chime in chat and let us know what the organization does, so we can understand it. Now, what about the elements themselves? So how do you feel about the icon above the words, without knowing what the organization is about just yet? So Rachel says clean and memorable. would look nice in a merchandise. And that's a good observation. I mean, ultimately, particularly for nonprofit brands, it's really important because one way your supporters can help you, one way your volunteers can help you, one way that donors can help you who may not necessarily have the ability to donate constantly is buy your merchandise, buy your t-shirts, buy masks, buy coffee mugs, buy other things. Interesting observation from Larry. It looks very masculine, and that's a good observation. Again, it goes back to likability. Your visual identity should speak to your audience, and so even if you find something that's unique, if it's masculine, if it's only speaking to one part of your audience, and you're trying to connect with a bigger audience, that presents a challenge. Okay, great feedback. Let's look at the next one: Battle River Watershed Alliance. So Lior, let me just sort of catch you up. Lior, who founded the foundation, we're launching a platform that will allow every person in the world to give $1 per month and then vote for which organizations worldwide will be able to share in the pool of funds that we raise every month. And so that's the goal of the foundation. And so some of these comments that relate to the masculinity and the direction that this goes to definitely potentially impact the audience with whom you're talking. And one example, when you think back and do a SWOT analysis of, what are some of the challenges here, maybe to say, okay, maybe this is a good start and maybe it's memorable, but what if we add some color to make it clear that this isn't just for men, isn't just for the military. Okay, next one. And let me actually answer a question from Jameson Sellers. Let's say a business name is Meaningful Lives Counseling and Wellness Services. Is it appropriate or okay to have a logo with just the name Meaningful Lives as the brand without the secondary information about the organization? And the answer is absolutely yes. It depends largely on whether there's confusion with other existing names like that. So if your name is Apple and Pears Counseling or Apple and Pears charitable foundation, it's not okay to have the name Apple because you've got a brand that's one of the most successful in the world with that same name. But ultimately, if it's a unique name and isn't confusing to existing brands, it's okay to shorten your name and use that logo separately from the full name. In fact, if your organization, as many nonprofits do, has a longer name, it's perfectly fine to create a shortened version. What most organizations do in this case, and this is a good example, is they have two variations of their identity. They have the Battle River Watershed Alliance, a patch of some sort that they use in some situations. And then most of the time, they actually use the logo type, Battle River Watershed Alliance, that appears below that. So this gives them some flexibility. So if you find yourself with an organization and a very long name, then you can create a shorter version of it, which you use in most places, and a longer version where appropriate. All right, so feedback to this one. How do we feel about either of these designs? So from Katie, Katie says both of these images will suffer when they're made smaller, so very difficult to recognize. As an example, imagine the Battle River Watershed Alliance as a small icon in a social post, as I just made it. You can't see anything, read anything there. Battle River Watershed Alliance is much better in that respect. So Melinda says it looks older, and that's a fair statement because ultimately it does look like it's a bit dated. Now that's not necessarily a pejorative. It's not a negative thing. It may be that's the look the organization went for, but it could also reflect that the branding hasn't been updated to the 21st century, and that could be a good thing or a bad thing depending on what your organization is trying to do. At the end of the day, I would suggest for nonprofits, because increasingly you're going to be talking to millennials and Gen Z if you're not doing so already. They have slightly different expectations of visual identity than older generations. And so when you find yourself with a nonprofit brand that is trying to speak to millennials and Gen Z, but having a tough time doing it, part of the reason you're struggling could be your visual identity looks awkward to them and it looks dated to them where they're expecting something a little bit newer. Scott says prefers the lower one. It's cleaner. The top one is too busy for me, which is a really good observation. There's a lot going on in the top example. It's a nice illustration. There's lots of interesting visual elements, but there's quite a lot going on. Katie adds that they look like they're for two different organizations. And that's a good observation. If you have two variations of a logo, and remember, important to be consistent. If you have two different variations of a logo that you use occasionally, you're going to confuse people because these do not look anything alike. Let me show you an example of this Battle River Watershed Alliance, the top one, a way to simplify it. This is actually one of the examples we use on Crowdspring to show what a good logo might look like. This is for High Country Outfitters. And the reason I wanted to share this example is because you could see that they're telling a similar story. It's not the same story, but there are some elements that are just easier here. And let me just point them out. The image here is circular, but it's a little bit awkward in the way that it's presented. So it's much harder for our eyes to see it. There's a lot going on in that story. And it's really hard for us to figure out in glancing at it for 2 to 3 minutes. Whereas a simple version of this tells a much cleaner, much better story. Fewer colors, fewer elements, much stronger story. So when you look to tell stories in your branding, in your logos, on your websites, find ways to communicate stories in a more simpler fashion like this. Okay, let's take a look at our first site, which is also Battle Share Alliance. I wanted to start here because I wanted to emphasize that the logo is not your brand. There's much more to it. So we started with a logo, and you could see on their website, they use the full version of it. And then here's the rest of their website. And let me just do a quick scroll to give you a sense of what the rest of the site looks like. And then I'm looking for feedback on several things. I'm looking for you to consider how the logo is shown, the navigation elements at the top, the hero image. And the hero image, HERO, is everything above the fold on your screen. So if you're looking at this on a laptop, you're going to see this on your screen right away. If you're looking at it on a big monitor like me, you'll see a little bit more than that. But the hero space is where you have your main headline, where you have potentially a call to action, where you might use some images. And it sounds like Mel unmuted all of you, so you don't need to raise your hand. Just press the space bar and talk if you want to give feedback. So feedback about this part of the website.
I think the colors really work within the logo. At least it's showing up in that blue and the gold at the top. It does change as you keep going down. When you scroll down, there was more rainbow colors that I think we're bringing in the other logo as well.
Okay, good observation. Other thoughts? I mean, one thing you could see in the navigation elements, and this is a choice that we all have to make, there is a lot going on here. You've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 items plus the logo. That's a lot to include in here. I would encourage all of you to really strictly look at that and find ways to consolidate certain things, because it's just really tough to present that and to say to a person, all of this is equally important. So look for things that maybe can go to the footer. Look if you can combine them. So for example, is it possible to combine our watersheds and watershed management planning into a single item? Is it possible to reduce watershed management planning to watershed planning or something like that? Because ultimately the way you communicate extends your identity. If it's confusing, if it's not easy to navigate and decipher, it would be really tough. Rachel asked, what would you say is a good rule of thumb for the number of tabs? So think about it this way. There is no scientific answer to this. Every tab you add, every word you add creates noise, creates friction with the reader. So that's how you should look at it. If you have a single example, single tab, great, but it may not let somebody navigate properly. So I would say, 4 or 5 probably at the extreme here, not much more. And if you have more than that, you're already doing drop downs here. So it's not too difficult to combine a few of these into a single place where you can drop down. Okay, what about the hero? How do we feel this photo and attend our GAM connects with the brand, and how does it communicate whatever message is intended to be communicated here? So UN says, I think the top layout might be too large, might let the audiences, the audiences may not know there's stuff at the bottom. And a comment related to that from Sandra Emily, looks like there are many different fonts used. Both really good observations. There's a lot of different font treatments on these pages, and a lot of differential spacing. Like the spacing between Battle River Watershed Alliance is different for some of the other spacing. And spacing makes things easier or harder to read. And I'll give you an example. In this Battle River Watershed Alliance, because there's so much space between the two lines, it doesn't intuitively appear to us that this is all the same headline. It feels like these are two different things. Whereas the paragraph below it, the stuff I just highlighted, actually is more readily readable as connected to each other. So do find ways that you can connect these better. Rachel says, I like the way they use the wave. And that's a good example. That bottom flare to the wave nicely complements what they started in the logo. So you can visually, even though you're not thinking about it, you visually appreciate that there's a connection between what they started in the logo, how the flare and the B and the flare and the R are connected to this image. And these are nice ways to communicate your brand identity across your website and other elements. So one thing that is challenging here is it's not clear for whom the call to action is designed. Attend our AGM. First of all, I don't know that every single person that gets to the site is going to know what an AGM is. Second of all, what's the main message that you want to communicate? Now, there is a slider, so you can do a variety of things here, but not everybody's going to know that you can do a variety of things by pushing this. And so for your organization, the way to think about your website is, what's the most important thing you can communicate about your organization to a person that visits your site? Because at the moment, what Battle River Watershed Alliance is doing is saying the most important thing to us is to get people to attend our AGM. It's not to tell you about our organization. It's not to solicit donations. It's not to tell you about the mission. It's not to tell you about the watersheds, but it's attend our AGM. And the question is that the smartest thing for you to communicate to your audience when they visit? Audit your own websites the same way. Are you communicating the message you need to communicate? Okay, let's look at the next example. So it's Marty Tercios Therapeutic Golf Foundation. And again, looking for feedback on any of these elements, whether it's a logo, colors, navigation, fonts, typography, voice. Let me scroll just so you see more of it.
The copy is all in a wide variety of different sizes, which makes it a little bit harder to read. And it's also flush up against the image on the left side, which also makes it much more difficult to read. And it, as a result of that, just looks a little bit unprofessional.
Okay, good observation from Katie. So lots of comments about the color green and makes it difficult to read, and ultimately you lose the header. So one challenge when you have so much of a similar color here is it's really hard to understand, what you can do on this page. This header, home, donor relations, events, facility, contact or donate, is lost. Remember, a person might visit your website for 30 seconds. And if they don't see anything interesting, they're going to leave. And so they need to be able to see what's the navigation. Where can I find the navigation? So this is an odd place to put navigation because normally it would be at the top. They'd want to be able to quickly process what is this organization about and what does it do? And so back to what I said a few minutes ago, every single word on a page creates friction. And so when you have this much copy, you are expecting that a person is going to read all of it to be able to look at it. Here's the thing. Almost nobody reads all copy. We tend to read headlines. So when a normal person gets to this, they probably won't even see Marty Tercios Therapeutic Golf Foundation. The first thing they're going to see is COVID-19 schedule, call for reservations. And I'm guessing when I first showed you that page, that's what all of you saw. The next thing you're going to see is stay healthy and stay home and the phone number. Is that the most important thing to communicate if your organization is trying to communicate with potential donors, with potential volunteers. And then ultimately, when you have lots of different font sizes, and there's probably 10 different font sizes and treatments in here, it's making it very, very unreadable. Also, remember to proofread your pages. If you've got a Google Analytics tag, make sure that this looks like it's just improperly formatted. That's why it's showing on the page. So find what's important, communicate it cleanly, and in this case, it would be much stronger to have elements of the color green to reflect that this is about golf, but let the page breathe a little bit more with a different complementary color. Okay, let's look at another example. This is the Family and Youth Institute, FYI. So again, we're looking for feedback on anything from the logo to any of the other elements, including the hero. And let me scroll for a few seconds so you could see the rest of the page. So too many buttons on the homepage from Llama. Pretty fair assessment. You've got action items, but they kind of scream at you. So one of the challenges on a page like this, if you think about it, when you got to this page, I suspect more than half of you probably saw those buttons, not the hero, not the name, but those buttons. And the thing is, when you get to something like this and you see buttons, what does it actually tell you about the organization? And so when you think about ways to emphasize, think about visually ways you can point people to what you really need them to see. And in this case, what you probably want them to see is the hero. And one of the challenges of a hero, particularly when you have scrolling, and I see a lot of nonprofit pages have this, when you have a scrolling hero like this that ultimately cycles through. So ask yourself the question, can you legitimately read the title, so the subtitle, look at the image in each of these examples before it switches on you? And for most people, the answer is no, you won't be able to do it, which means that nobody is actually be able to understand any of this unless they stop it and point to a specific page and keep it on that page and read it. So when you think about transitions, built in time so that people could actually read each of these slides. It is important to show that you've got more information, but not at the expense of actually preventing people from reading the information that you're actually showing them. And so that's, Catherine had the same observation. Good use of white space here. There's a lot of places which are not consumed by other things, but again, there's some elements, we talked about the buttons that probably create a bit of friction with people. So Melinda says the pictures are clear on the populations they serve, and that's a good example. Back to the comment I made about 15 minutes ago, if you use images, if you use videos, be sure that they are connecting with what you're doing. So think of them as a different way of telling a part of the story you're trying to communicate. So these images are very consistent. The images we see at the top, the images we see at the bottom, tell a story about the population that this nonprofit serves. And it doesn't create any friction for us. It's easy for us to understand everything else because they work together and they help tell part of the story. If they were all confusing, we'd be struggling to figure it out. Here's why this is important. People interpret images 60,000 times faster than words. So when you get to a site, when you see a logo, when you see a sign, and you see images, you're going to understand or at least interpret those much faster than you would any word on those websites or the signs. So if your images are conflicting with the story that you're telling, that creates a problem. So one good observation, the youth element is not present. That's a good observation because the name of the organization is the Family and Youth Institute. And there are some good, clear examples of what potentially could be families, but it's not clear where the youths are. So really nice observations. Okay, let's look at the next one. This is Digna, the Canadian Center of Expertise in the Prevention of Sexual Exploitation and Abuse. So again, feel free to click the spacebar and give comments verbally. but also feel free to type them as you see. I'm picking them up as you're typing. So let's start with the logo. How do we feel about the logo?
I know it's Canadian, but other than that, I'm unclear on what they actually serve.
Okay. So the fact that we know it's Canadian is actually a very nice touch. I mean, ultimately, that's not necessarily an easy thing to accomplish, but they work that element within the logo. It's not always going to be clear what they do, and this is something I want to emphasize. And let's take an example like the Salvation Army. The Salvation Army has been around for a very long time. We know what they do. We know what they're about. We know their reputation. But think about the first day the Salvation Army opened for business. Their logo didn't explain what they did. So brands are ultimately successful because you invest the time and the resources and the storytelling and ultimately create brands that are memorable for people. But when you start out, a specific logo doesn't have to completely tell your story. In fact, asking a logo to do that would be asking way too much. And this is true of any. If you objectively look at Goodwill's logo, American Red Cross, United Way, or anything else, they're all going to suffer from the same challenge. So I'm not suggesting you need to devise a logo that tells your entire brand story. But what you need to do is focus on creating something that's memorable, that's professional, that can tell part of that story. So part of the story here is it's Canadian. Not clear what the other elements are at the moment. So there are a lot of colors, as Jessica points out, which can be distracting. First of all, when you have a lot of colors in a logo, it means everything you print is going to be much more expensive because most prints are going to be 1 or 2 colors. And if you use more than 2, it's going to require additional charges. So t-shirts, business cards, letterhead, anything like that. Trevor says, nice looking website with lots of white space. And that's true. You've got lots of good examples. One thing that I would encourage you to think about when you create, websites like this is find a way to work maybe a secondary color into the identity. So this is an example where the identity, the Digna logo, has these nice colors and elements. One of them is used on the website, but there's maybe a missed opportunity to use a few of them. So there's a magnifying glass that's used, that's a green, but maybe there's an opportunity to include one more. It doesn't have to look like kindergarten, but I think it could tell a nicer story if you can use some of the elements. And this is part of the understanding that when you create a visual brand, you want to create a logo and a website and your marketing materials that incorporate these elements. And so if we remember from the Watershed example, where the logo had these wavy elements and you had this wavy element in the image below that, those two are connected. Maybe not for 100% of the people that see it, but many people were subconsciously make that connection. And so this is the importance of using colors. Okay, let's look at the next one. This is way off Broadway community players. And if you have questions as we're talking, feel free to ask these questions in chat too. I'll be looking for questions and such. But what about here? Any thoughts about the logo or what's going on this website? And I'll start with an observation about fonts. And this is a pet peeve for me. If you look at this middle section, the blue, you have an interesting, playful, interesting font. And I like playful, interesting fonts, but here's the problem. And this is something that we constantly talk about with nonprofits, for-profit companies. Never sacrifice readability to create something unique. Because at the end of the day, if what you're trying to communicate is information and information is unreadable, then yes, you might have created something playful and unique, but not something that people understand. And one good example of that is, you can read It's a Wonderful Life, but the part below that, I'm not sure I could make out half of those letters. If I struggle, I could probably figure it out, but I'm never going to waste time on any site to try to figure out what they're trying to say to me if it's unreadable. So err on the side of readability. There are always examples of similarly playful fonts that do a nice job that are just simply more readable. Catherine says the abbreviated logo makes me think radio at first, WOBCP. That's probably a fair observation. Think about what people are going to interpret. Back to the first example where we started. If you just see a logo for someone, what is your takeaway from that? And somebody says, what does this organization do? What are you going to be able to say about that organization? And so ultimately, the question here is, do you need to somehow show the full name of the organization in the logo to meaningfully communicate what it's about? Because it's not a word. It's not easy to remember. WOBCP isn't the same as Apple, as Salvation Army, United Way. And so part of what you're trying to create is memorability. So think about ways you can incorporate memorability in your logo. One good example here is you've got those smiling faces, or a smiley and a sad face, or maybe a concerned face, that are memorable and different from what you normally see. Larry says another challenge is reading on an iPad or a cell phone. Absolutely. So anytime you shrink, and this is, a really good example, when you shrink websites and they're smaller, very hard to read some of this stuff. Natalie says the cowboy hats and the masks are great, classic theater image, but with the Texas flair. Good example. So this is a good example where somebody is using something that's commonly associated with theater, but is connecting it to a localized audience where you're not going to mistake this for a theater in Manhattan. And that's a really good example. And so Melinda says, because we're based in Texas, they're the theater masks. So this is a nice way to connect with the audience. Okay. Let's look at another example. Ottawa Valley Wild Bird Care Center. So anything from the, go ahead.
Hard to see the blue on that on the building. The contrast is a little bit different. Coloring would be good there.
Yep, great observation. There are two ways to solve that problem. So always be mindful of readability, because you want people to read it. And in this case, that's a great observation, really tough to see the blue. One way to solve this problem is to screen the image, meaning make it a little bit more opaque. And you just ask your designer to apply a filter to it. It'll make the words pop much more. And you can make this 50, 60, 70% opaque. The image will still be perfectly visible, but the words will be much more readable. The other way to do it is to change the color of the fonts that appear, because you are picking very specific images and you control the color. So a different color, like maybe white, is going to pop much better on these pictures than the blue, which doesn't have enough contrast. And remember that you don't need to raise your hand to speak. Just press your space bar and chime in with some comments. Melinda says the pictures move very fast. Good observation. We saw that earlier. If you want to communicate information, this is part of your brand story. Remember, this is just as important as your logo design, because it tells part of your brand story. So you can have a great logo, the best logo in the world, but if nothing else helps tell your brand story, you're going to have a tough time building a strong brand. So in this case, the information you're communicating may be very important, but slow it down. Slow it down to a reader that needs 10 seconds to read it. I know it sounds excruciatingly slow, but your goal is to get somebody to read this information, not struggle to see what you said to them. An observation from Brittany likes that the found a bird in distress is in red and bold and draws attention and easy to find. Good example. So when you ask yourself, what is one of the most important elements in this page? I suspect most of us would say it's the found a bird in distress. And that's a really nice visual element, because it shows this organization doesn't just want to tell you about the organization, but that they care about birds and they want to help you to solve a problem if you actually found a bird that's in trouble, and let them help. This is important for them to communicate. It connects to their brand story, which is that they care about birds. Okay, one other observation about the menu is, obviously too much. There's a lot going on here, so it's a lot better to see if you can group some of this stuff. For example, about and contact probably can be grouped. Maybe gallery and education could be grouped. So just make it cleaner so there isn't a lot, because think about it this way. If I come to this page and I have 30 seconds, what do you want me to see? What do you want me to read? What do you want to communicate? If I have 30 seconds, you don't want me to spend my 30 seconds looking at your menu. You want me to see found a bird in distress, very well executed here. You want me to see the hero and some of the words, and it's well executed here, except for the fact that it's just very quick and isn't nearly as readable. So instead of, as you could see in this example, white is better readable, but not quite as much. Screening would be much easier here. Okay, let's look at another example. Canadian Physicians for Aid and Relief. So feedback on the logo, navigation, colors, fonts, hero.
The top navigation part is nice because it's only just a couple of them and are where people would want to click. And then I think it's interesting that they do show where they're serving. So they're not specifically focusing in Canada, they're in other countries, I'm assuming. Well, sub-Saharan Africa.
Yep. All good observations. James says the pictures are saying a lot, and that's good. The pictures help tell the story. One observation about pictures, it looks like in that hero element, the pictures are being stretched. So if you, or at least some of the pictures are being stretched, they look distorted compared to the other pictures. And so that's an important part of the visual story you're telling, because visually, when we see something that we don't expect to see, like we see a normal picture and then a distorted picture, our brains are struggling to figure out what's going on here, which means we're not paying attention to the words that are being communicated to us. So find a better way to clean this up, make sure that your formats are accurate. The other thing, and you'll see this in these hero elements, you've got a headline and you have a subheadline. There's probably a lot of text, a lot more text than somebody can read. Obviously, it's scrolling very quickly, but one example that can be improved here too is when you think about readability, you've got a big headline here, you've got some text here, and then you've got find out more in store. So there's a challenge here. When you do this, you're consciously saying to the person who's reading, I want you to read this headline. I want you to read this headline. And you can ignore the stuff in the middle. And I don't mean you intentionally are doing it, but by choosing big sizes as a buffer around small text, that's effectively what people will be doing. So I suspect close to 100% of us, when we read this, read those two things. If that's your intent, get rid of this because nobody's going to read it. If that's not your intent, get rid of this because nobody's going to read the stuff that you actually intended people to read. And so you see these examples in a few places. Here's another example where pick a headline. It's either this one or this one. This one sounds very nice and it's probably better, but this one is distracting. And just to show you the difference, compare it to something like this, where you can read the headline, you can read the subheadline and learn more. It's not competing for your attention. Okay, let's look at the next one. So this is Bethesda project. And let me scroll.
I like it.
Let me scroll so you could see it. Yep, nice and clean. Some nice elements to it. One thing that's really nice, and this is actually a really good example for those of you that feel the need to communicate about COVID and the way you've adapted and what's going on and some of these other things. It's really nice to be able to do that at the top like they're doing in the banner, as opposed to taking a big part of your page to communicate that information. First of all, because it's more noticeable. It's the first thing that you see. It's not likely to get lost. Second of all, it gives you an opportunity to push people into the resources that you need them to read. And it's not taking away from communicating the important information about your organization. Third of all, you can click and get rid of it. So once you've read it, you can see the site as it was presented. So that's a very nice way to present it. Some good observations about contrast and the color blue as an accent. Melinda says I almost couldn't find the navigation, but I think it's nice because it doesn't distract, and that's a good point. So this is called a hamburger menu. where the navigation is intended to be similar to what you might find in a mobile phone. This is somewhat controversial because on a mobile phone, you don't really have a choice to put big navigation. You do see a lot of sites include navigation elements like this in a site. There's nothing wrong with that. It does make it a little tougher. One thing I would suggest is when you're including an element like this, rather than put it so much off to the site, bring it in a little bit. First of all, line it up with the logo so visually it could be on the same plane, but bling a little bit. Give it as much spacing from the edge as the logo might have here, maybe even a little bit more, just so it's in the view of the person looking at it. Because the way people read is from the left side, kind of down across the page, but then back to the left side. So it's rare that we're going to get to the right unless we see something on the right. And in this case, it's easy to miss that there's a navigation here. Let's see. Catherine says some text is a little small and hard to read, and that's a fair point. I actually, it's a pet peeve for me. I hate small text. Ultimately, it's about your audience, and it's about the things that you want to promote. And so when you look at the text on your site, look to see whether it's readable. And if you have so much white space like you do here, it's very well done in terms of white space. You probably have the ability to bump up some of the text 1 or 2 points. But remember, if you do that, everything else needs to be bumped up in relation to it, because when things have the same size, they compete for attention. So in this case, there's no question what you'll see first when you get to this page. You're going to see Bethesda project. You can't avoid it. It's right in the middle. And then you're either going to see, well, you're going to see support our mission. And then if you go back, you may see a caring family for Philadelphia's homeless. So ultimately, one thing you might experiment with in this case, because this is the first thing you'll see, since you know it from the logo and from the website, does it make more sense to put a caring family for Philadelphia's homeless as the large font in the middle, and Bethesda project about it is smaller? Because ultimately, in telling the story, you control what people will initially see when they get there. And so you might want to experiment with things like that. Scott says, I'd like to see somewhat bolder colors on the hero, even for just a highlight. And that may be a personal preference. That may be a good observation. I mean, ultimately, it's good to be able to take a photo that may be color and remove that color and give it a little bit of a starker contrast. On the other hand, you could accomplish something similar. So from a readability perspective, this makes it more readable, white on a darker, monotone color. If you wanted to accomplish the same thing with a colorful photo, apply a screen. Again, make it more opaque, less transparent, and in that way, the white can pop nicely on that example. Larry asked, can the title ever be moved to a different position or highlight the photo image? I think you're asking about, these examples. So the things you put in the middle. So the answer is, it depends on what you're trying to communicate in the hero image. So if you look at Crowdspring, you see that example where the title is to the left and you have a hero image to the right. So you could put it there if that's what you're trying to communicate, but it really depends on what you're really trying to accomplish. If you don't have a lot of words, if you have a hero image that takes up the full space, from a readability perspective, you're always going to be better putting it in the center, because that's where your eyes are going to be attracted to. And so this page does a really nice job putting front and center what they think is the most important thing for them. Okay, let's look at another example. We've got about 10 more minutes together. Feel free, as I said, to ask questions if you've got them. So this is Theatre Francais in Toronto. And I will scroll as I've been doing. So this is called a parallax effect. When, as you're scrolling, images are moving with you. Obviously, it's a creative site. So there's an expectation they're gonna be a little bit more fancy in what they do. And how do we feel about that?
Well, I think if you're going to go on the website, you already know that it's a theater, but I think just by you presenting it, I didn't really know it was a theater. I had to think about it for a second and look for the name.
Okay, good observation. So maybe in an effort to be creative and different, there's a missed opportunity to communicate a little bit more clearly. So I suspect you'd agree with me that you don't need to put all of this text about the company, but maybe a sentence or two somewhere above here, similar to what we saw in the Bethesda project, to communicate that this is a theater would help most people understand that.
I'd love a CTA right on that front page that tells me when the next show is and click to buy tickets.
Okay. So Katie says very clear that they want you to check out their 2021 season because that's the main focus. And that's good. I mean, ultimately, if that is what they want to communicate, then I think we could all agree that they're doing a pretty decent job communicating. I think some of us are struggling to really understand this as a theater. So maybe that's the missed opportunity. Catherine says the menu and logo are small and hard to find. And that's a fair statement. There are two issues here. The logo probably is a bit too small and really tough to read. It should probably be about 50% bigger and maybe just a little more emphasized. The menu is a little hard to read simply because you have changing colors. Now you can, and let me show you, this is a good example of contrast and readability. So focus on support us in the menu. The word us, very highly readable. It's white on brown. And then look at something like schools. You could see that parts of that are much harder to read. And that's because you have white on lighter green, and in some cases, an even lighter green. So when you have this situation, you have two ways to address it. You can have a different color for the bar that connects with your brand colors, or you can, again, screen part of that image. You don't have to necessarily screen the full image, but you can screen part of that image. So still show the tree, but just for more readability. It will create much more visibility. Okay. What about the rest of this? Any other comments about what's below? Like for me, and this is part of what I want you to think about when you look at your own brands. There's a disconnect for me oftentimes when I see something visual like this, and I scroll down and then I get to something a little bit more standard like this. To me, this tells a kind of an awkward, inconsistent story because what I'm expecting is something visually interesting as I scroll. And when I see something that isn't as visually interesting, I'm a little bit disappointed. And the bottom part of it is very nicely done. So this, doesn't have to be a huge investment to make it visually interesting. But when you tell your brand stories, connect the things together. So I think this is an opportunity where they can do a better job in this blog and company section to make it look as interesting visually as the rest of that section. Okay, let's take a look at another one. Mid-Atlantic Lutherans in Mission, Marlene. How do we feel about logo here, the navigation, the rest of the site? So Jameson says too much white space, and it's probably true. I mean, part of what you have to choose is how do you tell your brand story in a space like this? So if you think about it, you have to go down about half a page before you start seeing anything. The logo is super big here, and it's taking up a lot of space and just a lot of space at the top, which pushes the navigation to the bottom. So it's a little awkward because it's also competing for attention with the logo because there are a lot of words. So you're always going to be better off taking a navigation like this, which isn't significant, and moving it to the top here, and then making the logo smaller and moving it to its more traditional top left side, because it'll just create a more friendlier environment for whoever comes to your page. Lama says the picture and the illustration has a sense of consistency, and that's true. You've got colors that are used throughout that help tell the story. So somebody clearly thought about how do you connect some of these colors to the story that we're telling in the image. Jameson says the logo can stand alone, and that's a good example. So this is an example of you have a cross, but it's a unique cross. It's not a kind of cross that you typically see. And so this is somebody that thought, how can we create a unique identity that can go on a t-shirt and still stand for our organization where people won't confuse us. And you could take the actual name, the logo type, and you can use it separately too without the cross, and that'll be perfectly fine. So ultimately, as you get through it, one of the opportunities is, the missed opportunities rather, is what's the organization about? So the question you should ask yourself is, why do I have a website? What is it that the website needs to do for me to tell my brand story? So if at the end of the day, your website is there simply because somebody says you should have a website, but you don't have a good reason for it, then something like this might be okay. But if your goal is to get people to, let's say, donate or volunteer, then part of what you want to do in your website is communicate why. What is it that you do? What's your mission? What's your vision? Why would they volunteer? Who do you help? And in this case, you do answer part of the question, who do you help? But you're not telling a story about the organization and what it's trying to do. And I think that's a missed opportunity. So think of a way that when you're not there, your brand could tell that story. Put a different way. If somebody knocks on your door and says, what does Malim do? You'd give them an answer. That's what you want to communicate on the website as well. All right, let's take a quick look at one more. So this is Winchevsky Center. And let me scroll. There are, by the way, there are a few that we're not going to have time to look at. There's probably about 6 or 7. I will put together some notes on the remaining 6 or 7. I'll share it with Keela, and I'll share it with all of you. That way, everybody who wanted some feedback will get feedback. So, and we'll share it with the whole group so you can also see that feedback, much like we've been doing. Comments on the Winchevsky Center. So no logo. Mel says no logo or organization name anywhere. Good observation. Ultimately, you want to communicate something about your brand. And if it's impossible to tell what your brand is, other than by looking hard at the URL, then you're missing an opportunity to create that association in somebody's minds. And so definitely, if you create a brand, if you create a logo, use it. One thing you'll notice in the rotating pictures is one of these pictures is upside down, which and I don't know, there may be a lot of them here, so we may not get to it, but definitely proof everything that you create, because you want to make sure that you don't run into those kinds of situations. Anything else? Anything about the hero and the navigation and what appears below it?
I kind of have a feel for what they do. The words are, I mean, the secular Jewish and social justice, it sounds like it's a Jewish organization that isn't like a temple or a synagogue, but does more work within the community. But like Mel had said, I don't know who they are.
Yep. That's a good observation. I'm a big fan generally of communicating a story using sentences, not words. I think we are generally, and it doesn't mean you would need to replace secular Jewish social justice, but somewhere on the page, it would be really helpful to tell in a sentence or two the story of what this organization does, because generally when we talk to each other, so if I said to the founder of this organization, what do you do? It's highly unlikely they're going to say secular Jewish social justice. They're going to say, we do this, or we help these kinds of people, or here's what we've done in our communities. And so when you speak on your website, when you speak at events, try to tell your story in the same way that you would do it normally. Otherwise, when you're building your brand, it creates this inconsistency where you're speaking one way at an event, or when you're talking to donors or volunteers, and then when they get to your site, you're speaking in a very different way. There's a question from Larry: are little pictures of people a useful addition to a website, even when they don't seem that memorable? So the answer is, it depends. First of all, I wouldn't use tons of photos, because tons of photos are really tough to keep up with. So in this case, the reason they're showing so many photos is they're showing that they are doing lots of things in the community. So that's a good thing. It shows that they have an impact in the community. The fact that the pictures aren't memorable isn't necessarily a bad thing, because what pictures do is connect with the story. They help tell part of the story. So if we looked at these pictures for a minute, we could probably get a feel, and you could see that in this picture, for example, you have the same element you have at the top that's connected with the organization. We could tell that they're helping people in the community. So they don't have to individually be memorable, but the stories pictures tell should be memorable. All right, I think we're at 90 minutes. I probably exhausted your patience quite a bit at this point. So let me stop screen sharing. As I said, I will, let's see, let me just switch to my normal camera. I will, as I said, give feedback to all of you for the ones that, for the ones we didn't cover. Do take a look at the nonprofit branding guide that I shared in the presentation. I'll send that PDF version to KeeLabs, and they'll distribute it to everybody so that you can have a copy of it. But there we cover a lot of these concepts. And the fundamental, the last thing I want to leave you with is this. It's not enough to have a great logo to build a strong nonprofit brand. It's just part of it. The decisions you make, the choices that you make in your websites, and the way you talk and the way you describe your brand are all part of building a strong brand. So good design doesn't overcome a poorly constructed, poorly communicated organization, but good design can help you tell your story in remarkable ways. Thanks for everything you do for people in the world.
And thank you, Ross. That was absolutely amazing. I always love these review sessions with you. They're so fun. And I know everyone is super engaged and loves this kind of stuff. And it's just really helpful. Also helpful that, you know, all of you are just so inviting and you know, reviewing, I know isn't easy, and to hearing everyone's feedback, but all of you are very nice, and it's always great to hear different opinions and how people see your brand. So thank you everyone as well for joining in and participating. Yes, so that'll conclude today's session. I know we went a little bit over time here, but I definitely think it was worth it. Quickly, before we do sign off, I just wanted to remind you all that our next webinar will be on Wednesday, December 9th at 10 a.m. So same time as today. The session will be led by Lydia Varesco-Racoma, where she'll continue the conversation on branding and dive into how to create a nonprofit branding guide. And if you haven't already registered for that, we've just posted the link in the comment section to sign up. And I just wanted to remind everyone again that today's session will be recorded. So in case you missed anything, wanted to review anything, we'll be sending that out along with Ross's slide deck by the end of the day today. And then we'll also get back to all of the reviews that we didn't get to. We'll send that as well in the follow-up email, or if not in another email. Not too sure how that'll go, but either way, we will definitely get that to you. And Ross, I don't know if you had any final words. Thanks again so much for today. Had a blast with you as always.
Yeah, well, I appreciate everybody being involved and giving this feedback. Hopefully it gives you the knowledge to be able to do this for each other, and certainly to do this for your own brands, because I think branding is extremely important, and I want to encourage you to tell that story in the strongest way possible for all the good that you do.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, everyone, and enjoy the rest of this wonderful Tuesday. Take care.
Goodbye.
Bye. Oh.